It is my honor and my privilege to introduce my friend Natalia Mehlman Petrzela from the New School, who actually has about 15 titles, but my favorite of them today is that she is a member of Or Initiative's advisory board. And she's also been the lead historian on a really interesting and innovative new form of curriculum for New York City. And so while we're talking about innovations in the classroom, I thought it would be fun to hear a little bit about that experience and how it ties to a lot of the things we've been talking about today. So Natalia, tell us a little bit about Hidden Voices.
Great, and thank you, and congratulations, Vikki. I mean, this is incredible. So thank you to everybody, and
Thank
you and the OR group. And I'm glad to be closing while people are eating because, you know. So it's funny that you call Hidden Voices innovative curriculum because compared to some of the very tech-forward stuff that we're doing, it's pretty old school. Like, I'm like, can we include audio clips? But here's what here, and they're like, no, too much for us. So here's what Hidden Voices is. So Hidden Voices is a curricular project of the New York City Department of Education. But let me say this once, and I'll say it again. It's available free to everyone in the world, everywhere. So if you're a teacher, I should say, or a professor, I think it can be valuable. It was started in 2018, and the idea was to provide curricular resources for minoritized groups and people within those groups that had been hidden from dominant historical narratives. So there was, and they're still around, an LGBTQ one, a disability one, a New Yorkers one, and despite New York City being the place where more Jews live than in any city outside of Israel, there was not a Jewish one. Then October 7th happened. You might have heard that there were some anti-Semitic events that took place in classrooms, including in New York City, and basically the DOE was authorized to create this program, and they asked me to be lead scholar. In sum, what it is basically curricular materials that any K through 12 or college social studies or US history teacher can use to supplement their existing work. So they're profiles and primary sources, in my case of Jews in American history, that fit in nicely. We've tried very hard to do that with, you're teaching the Civil War, you're teaching the Revolution, you're teaching, westward expansion, and they work alongside along with that work.
So a lot of what we've been talking about today is how do you add what kids need without adding a lot to class time? We've talked a lot today about evidence and what kids understand to be true and what it means to build a shared evidence base when everything feels contested. And this is not your first go-around because you are a historian of culture wars and culture wars related to education. So I'd love to hear from you what feels unique in this moment, what feels like it's part of a trend line of where we've been. And in some ways, there's a nostalgia of we used to do things a certain way, and maybe we didn't. I don't know. So what do you, we've been talking a lot about new tools, new developments, new innovation, but nothing comes out of nowhere. So from that lens, like what feels different, what feels like a through line to you?
About this moment? Okay, so one thing which is definitely a through line, and it's more than a through line, it's like more than history rhymes, but history really says the same words sometimes, is that some of the very intense curricular battles that we have today have been waged with literally almost exactly the same language. Like, look at the 1960s, look at the 1930s, and you will hear complaints about commie teachers trying to indoctrinate good American children to be radical leftists who hate America and hate their family. That's like right now on X, I promise you someone is saying that. That also was in like the American Legion magazine in the 1930s. That is very, very consistent. Those complaints tend to be levied against curricula in social studies or that take up questions of American identity or of identity overall. So I think that that's very, very consistent. I think there are several things that have changed, but I think one thing that has changed a lot is that these very local battles can like instantly blow up into national things and into national controversies. And what is very different in the policy landscape today is that as opposed to earlier in the 20th century, you didn't really have state or national policies that were banning, like talking about so-called divisive concepts, right? And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, you'd have a lot of this was exacerbated in COVID, but you'd have, I'm thinking of, there was one class meeting, or it was like a PTA meeting or something in like Portland, Oregon, and some very ridiculous stuff was said, and all of a sudden, like overnight, it's like, these crazy lefties are coming to your school. We need legislation against this. And so I think that media environment and the acceleration of it is new. One more thing, just as a historian. So like my first work in the history of education was studying these culture wars in schools in California, actually. And there was actually similar kind of worry about the flurry of information outside of local contexts. But it would feel so quaint. There were these pamphlets that people would send away for. Like I have one in my office. Is the schoolhouse the place to teach raw sex? That's what it was called, okay? And it was written by this preacher. And that sold like 1 million copies. But you had to send away for it, right? And so I think that's the structure of things is quite similar, and sometimes the language, but the media is very different and the speed is very different, and thus the policies are very different.
I mean, what you're saying parallels how we talk about politics, right? And the decline of local media. But, the idea that everybody's talking about a mayoral race in New York City or a governor's race in Virginia, it has no material impact on your life if you don't live in those places in any real way. And yet these conversations become national. The reach is so immediate. And there's something that you said about sort of, something happens at a school board meeting in Portland, and the next day it's having spillover effects in places that are becoming policy issues, right? Not even a conversation, but something that could be more enduring than that. Really speaks, I think, to the fear that a lot of educators have about what happens if you become the next viral controversy for talking about something in class. And one of the things we haven't talked about today is obviously that California, like New York, New York has already instituted a ban of cell phones in schools. California has passed it and is going to be in the process of that. One of the things we haven't talked about is how that might open more space for conversation because there is less fear of being recorded. And so just thinking about the technologies and the affordances that they create for spreading what happens in one place instantaneously to somewhere else without having to send away for a pamphlet, how, as a historian who's kind of looking at the present time with that longer through line, what do you see as the kind of the implications of the history for that?
It's kind of new because these digital technologies swept in so quickly, but I think that so I think there's not as clear of a kind of historical through line there, but I think the implications, I mean, I don't predict the future for my job. I talk about the past, but I think that you're exactly right that I think if we all are going to be looking up from our phones, which is going to happen more and more, there's going to be much more of this engagement because there's nothing else to do, right? There's part of that. And then I also think this piece you raised, I think is very, very important that, there is so much justified fear, I think, of being recorded, of having your words taken out of context. And if we can eliminate some of that, it's never all going to go away, but if we can eliminate some of that, I think that we will be in a much better place. And it seems like some of that is, it is happening through. That's one good part about these bans, I think.
As a historian, I know you have a reverence for original texts.
Yeah.
We're in a moment where young people told us over and over again, I don't know how to figure out what's true anymore.
Right.
How do you think about curriculum that rely on original texts and what their role to play is at a time when we are trying to make classrooms places where kids build a shared evidence base again so that they can have conversations based on a shared understanding of a complex topic?
I think, and this really is the historian in me talking, I mean, using primary sources as much as possible is so, so vital. Now, that's easier said than done. I think it's really hard to pick those sources. It's really hard to, it takes a long time, right, to be reading primary sources. You have to contextualize them. So the way I try to do it, and even though I'm teaching college, I have taught middle school and I worked on this curriculum. So, and I also think my college students are not that different from high school students, let's be honest. I end up spending a lot of time reading secondary material myself and writing lectures that incorporate that secondary material, and then spending time doing primary source analysis with students in class. And the reason, there are many reasons for that. One, I think it is a good economy of everyone's abilities and talents and time. But I also, and this gets to our kind of distraction moment, it's getting a little better, I guess, but I now feel like I have to plan each class meeting almost like as its own self-contained content, because you're not really sure if students are doing the reading. There are these attendance issues. You don't know if they will have been there before or after. And primary source analysis together in class is something where the kids who have been doing the work all the time can really go deep, but also you're not totally alienating the student who made it to class that day and, but couldn't really talk about the readings because they didn't do it. So I find that primary source analysis is useful in that way.
It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Another thing that we haven't spent enough time on today, because we have been talking about digital and we've been talking about different ways to enable students to develop the kinds of skills and digital discernment that will allow them to better integrate or maybe put in its place what they see online compared with the things that they learn in school, is the idea of focus and attention being something that is a muscle too, right? The ability to have sustained attention on something that you're reading, whether it's a primary source or being engaged in a conversation, is something you actually have to practice. And so I don't want anyone to walk away today with the idea that we are advocating for more tech being the answer to everything. I think what we are advocating for is the idea of the right tech as the right tool at the right time. There are a lot of spaces and times, especially in K-12, where no tech is the best tech, because what they really need as a communication technology is you, and they need each other. And them learning, I say this in my own classes, that I ask them how many of them have had an internship, and most of the hands go up. And I say, have you noticed that people my age and older sometimes walk into a meeting with a laptop, and sometimes they walk in with pen and paper? Why do you think they do that? Because some of it's because they're old, and some of it is something else. What's the something else? And they said, because and one of them will always recognize that when the boss walks in with a pen and paper, they're fully engaged in a way that they're not when the laptop is open. And for a generation, especially coming out of the pandemic, where technology was the tool for everything because we had no choice, this is part of the correction that they need, is that there are times where you need less, not more. And that being in a space together with nothing between you and the thing you are learning, and nothing between you and your peers, whether it's a historical source or a face-to-face conversation about what you've read and prepared to be able to engage, that is sacred. There is something sacred about the immediacy of being in a place together where you have each other's full and undivided attention for the time that you are together, that is a gift you are giving each other, and that it deepens learning in a way that they haven't experienced as much of as they really should have and maybe deserve to. So.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I teach at a seminar college, and that's literally what we are pitching to students we give. But so much of that experience is lost when we're all mediated through a screen and, doing many of the other things that distract us, understandably.
Well, and that's when you and I were talking about preparing for this session, we were talking about the difference between showing something on a shared screen so that the whole class is experiencing it together versus them looking at individual screens in a lesson plan, and how much more powerful it is for them to be having a shared experience as opposed to, can you pull out your phones and tell me something you're seeing in your feed? That first of all, you're going to lose a lot of people when you do that, right? If we had done the session that before Adnan's and Simon's, and we'd said, pull out your phones and look at this video, right? Instead of showing it to you on a screen, we would have lost half of you to your email. And we would have lost another quarter of you to your text messages, because you would have been out of the space that we're in if we hadn't kept it in front of everybody. And obviously for young people, you'd lose them into 3 more apps after that too, right?
Yeah, and so here's a historical antecedent for you. I'm reminded of 2 moments in the history of education. One was when there started being standardized textbooks in like the 1850s. Before that, how did you learn to read? Like, bring whatever Bible your parents have at home in, and we hope it's the same version, and we'll all learn to read that way. That had that same diffusion problem. And then similarly, and don't ask me the year, but it's some years after that.
I won't have the capability to ask you.
Okay, good. Someone's going to fact check us. But when chalkboards become being used, you start to have that unifying experience of everybody looking at the front of the room and students like having that shared screen, you know? I mean, when I talk about the history of education with my kids, I'm like, oh, my kids, my lovely college students who are full-grown adults, my college students, I talk about, we're going to talk about ed technology and the history of technology in this class. Did you know that a chalkboard is technology, right? And that's not something that they really think of. And so I think that's really important to think about these through lines and how we teach and learn too. And also, you know,
do you have to explain to them what a chalkboard is first?
Oh, well, it's so funny. You know, this is a perfect crowd. You know that 2016 trend that was going on? So I'm looking at my 2016 pictures. I'm like, I used to like write everything on the chalkboard before class. Now I project everything. And like my college students now, we don't even have chalkboards anymore.
No.
So, yeah.
Every once in a while, I like to show a picture of an overhead projector to my children, just to see if they can even begin to understand what that is.
I'm going to make some runoffs for the class.
Some
runoffs. If you know, you know, people.
A rotary phone. I mean, we could spend a lot of time
exactly.
here.
We're here all day, folks.
We really are. I want to ask, because you've written about culture wars in schools, but you've also written, I mean, you may recognize her face from the History Channel if you were a History Channel person. She's done a lot of public-facing history. But you also write about popular culture and the history of popular culture, fitness, et cetera. One of the things that we're doing with OR is really like sort of imagining alternative ways into doing the things that are hard for people to do, right? That rather than coming at, we're going to talk about really serious, hard things that make you crawl up the walls today, let's start from things that we know you're interested in as students. Let's start from things that we know teachers recognize kids need. And let's see if through those conversations about tech and learning and what it teaches us about each other, we can get ourselves closer to how we talk about the hard things without wringing our hands over how hard it is going to be to talk about the hard thing. You found ways into talking about hard things through popular culture and its history. So I want you to talk a little bit about kind of these creative alternative routes into the things.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because, as you said, I started my career writing about the culture wars in education. I'm still writing about it. I have found myself as a combatant in these culture wars a little too often myself. It still fascinates me, but the sort of other part of my work, which I realize isn't even that other, is telling these stories about popular culture. So I wrote this book about workout culture. I made a podcast about the Chippendales as a kind of lens on 1980s America. Now I'm writing a book with
know about that.
Oh my gosh,
I'm learning
that's
so much.
Some of my best work, Vicki. It's called Welcome to Your Fantasy, and it's very much about Los Angeles, so you're Southern California Italian. But it's funny when I would share that I was working on these projects with folks, they're like, oh, that's cute, or that's fun. And I'm like, all right, just like go with me for 10 pages or for 20 pages or listen for one episode, and you'll see that it's these fun, kind of sexy topics. You bring people in, but we are still learning about capitalism and power and gender and politics and infrastructure and all the important things. And the thing that I find, it's not just like give them some candy, but put the broccoli or like the milkshake with vegetables in it or whatever that.
Chocolate-covered broccoli.
Yeah, chocolate-covered broccoli. It's not just that, but I actually realize that if I'm like, all right, people. We are going to talk about like gentrification today. Everybody is already like, well, what language are they using? And I know where I stand on this debate. And like the hackles are already up. When you come in with these stories that haven't already been polarized in this very predictable way, people are much more open and excited to like listen and learn and contribute and sometimes even change their idea. And I'll say that Jewish American Hidden Voices is very much in that spirit. Mm-hmm. There are no male strippers in there. Sorry, people. We do have Dr. Ruth as one of our profiles. They're a very wonderful American Jewish woman, Holocaust survivor, not American, not born in the U.S., but, Jewish American Hidden Voices is in many ways a reaction to the fact that if kids learn in secular schools, learn about Jews at all, it tends to be in Holocaust education, by the way, which I think is tremendously important, in a kind of anti-Semitism training after some incident happens, which I also think is very important, or in some often ill-informed, like Israel-Gaza debate. And we think that actually, if you really want to understand U.S. history, American Jewish history is a huge part of that. And there are so many stories that are not fundamentally about being the victims of hatred or being involved in some of the most controversial issues of our time. And so, and so we think that like integrating these stories from the get-go, there's fun history there. We have no hero worship in there, but there are people who are really interesting and you admire them, and there are others who are much more complicated. Exactly. But it's part of the fabric of history, not a special unit you do over here or only in a divisive like concepts conversation.
Which is what we've talked about with historically marginalized or minoritized Americans for a very long time, is that when they are spoken about, it's either in its own unit or it is the most extraordinary in some either notoriety or extraordinary in terms of leadership that we end up hearing about them. But, for every Cesar Chavez, there is 1,000 farm workers. Mm-hmm. And the farm worker story is part of America, too. And their children's stories are part of America, too. And for every, leader of the civil rights movement who happened to be Jewish, there's garment workers, right?
So there's
just earning a living.
Yeah,
and that's part of the American story.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. And I think there's that importance of mixing sort of the titans and the celebrities that you've heard of with everyday people. I also think, and we were careful about this in our curriculum, also integrating people of different kind of political persuasions, yes, which you don't often have. Or let's put it this way. In many identity-based curricula, which Hidden Voices are one of them, you may not have the full or a wide range of political perspectives in there. So for example, we have, communist labor organizers, we have Clara Lemlich, we also have Ayn Rand, know? And I realized that studying identity and curriculum, that was really important to me. I remember my first dissertation work was on Spanish bilingual education here in California, and I remember presenting maybe it was like a Latino studies conference or something, and I talked about certain Latino groups who were opposed to bilingual education, mm-hmm, who were very politically conservative in the 1960s, and that was considered like inappropriate to talk about in this history. Like, this is an embarrassment in this past and in this story, and why are you focusing on it? And to me, to only glorify at all, but also to glorify a certain political perspective, it just is such a disservice to kind of accurate historical thinking, and also to how we engage with each other on all of these things that we've been talking about for the last day.
Well, it also creates such a monolith out of a community, yes, in a way that's deeply unhelpful, mm-hmm, right? The idea that an entire group of people would be on one side of an issue with no discussion, no debate about it, creates the artificial binaries that we are talking about as wanting to break down. There is always diversity within a group of people on any issue that you talk about. And if you start identifying that diversity and breaking down the idea that there are two sides, you can start to find where there's common ground where you had assumed people were opposite, yeah, to each other. And I don't know if he's still in the room, and if he isn't, there he is.
Taking note.
Adnan said something the first time that we had him at Chapman in this room. It's actually in the report because it's something I think about 3 times a week. And the first time Adnan was in this room, he was with an Israeli-American student from UCLA, and they were talking about how in the midst of the encampments and the campus, upheaval that they had, they formed a standing together group of Jews and Israelis and Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians who refused to join a side, and that they were going to be in favor of, in Gaza and Tel Aviv, all the children want to live. A third way, a third option. And he started his comments by saying, if you must pick a team, pick the side of the builders and not the destroyers. And I think that fits very well with what you're saying, is that when you change the groupings, right, when you make diverse what is happening within a group of people, you can see where some of those people might have more common ground with who they would have thought of as opponents, and that they're not quite as harmonious and flat as they've been made out to look. And that that's true for any conflict that is enduring, whether it's a culture war over bilingual education, which we clearly are not done with, or any of the issues we might bring to bear. And that's why, we focused on the post-October 7th period because it's a high-stakes case, not because it's the only thing we could be talking about, not because it's the only thing we should be talking about, but because anything that we spend years and years talking about, I say to my students when I teach civil discourse at the college level, if your understanding of an issue that has endured for decades or a century could fit into a hashtag, I would venture to say you are yet to understand it. Because if it was so simple, we'd be done with it, and we would have moved on to something else. And the fact that we haven't means it requires more of your attention, and you're capable of being serious about it. I want to open up some time for some comments, some reflections, some questions. And before we do that, I just want everybody to look up at these glorious stained glass windows and this beautiful space that we're in. And I'm so grateful to the staff at the Fish Interfaith Center for letting us be in their space yesterday and today, but it is the most gorgeous place to kind of slow down and reflect and to think about things. It is a space that was designed for that. Classrooms have been engineered not to be. And I hope that one of the things you take away from this is perhaps that we redesign them to feel a little bit more like what it feels like. Every time I walk in here, I feel like I just exhale and I feel a little calmer than I did when I was standing outside. I hope everyone else has had that experience, but I'm so grateful that we were able to have this space, because when we were preparing for this, it was the only place I wanted to do this. So I just want everybody to admire the different colors, the different light, and kind of how looking at that sort of create something. So let's have a little bit of time for your thoughts and your questions and reflections. April. Can we get a microphone? Sorry. I know you can. No, I think we're coming, I think. Okay, thank you.
Something that came up in an anecdotal conversation yesterday, and this is for both of you, is the opposite. Like, there are people here that would want to do what you're talking about. What are your challenges, or like for the state of New York, for your work, for teachers who are not going to engage or who may, in fact, do the exact opposite to sabotage some of the work that you're doing, or to introduce fake narratives or false narratives because either they've been hijacked by the algorithm or have ulterior motives or are any number of motives. I don't want to put motives in anyone's mind, but
Yeah, I was having a similar offline conversation in the cocktail hour yesterday, or the dessert hour yesterday. I think that's really hard because there are always going to be kind of bad faith actors, and I think we can't assume those are like our primary audience. I actually think, and this is perhaps a bit too meta, not in the tech company way, but I actually think what we need to do is sort of bring back the idea that objectivity is something worth striving for. I mean, I think that one of the big picture problems that we have is this notion that I know these folks as colleagues, some very good people who really believe that their job is to recruit students in what they think is the correct moral and ideological position of the time. And that because objectivity is so elusive, we can never really know the whole truth, it's not worth pursuing. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down as an educational philosophy. And so whenever I have more than a few minutes to kind of talk about this work that I'm doing, I talk about the importance of the best thing my students can tell me is when they're like, we don't really know what you think of this issue because I've brought in multiple sources. And as imperfect as my attempts at neutrality are always going to be, I try, right? And so I think we've got to kind of keep sermonizing for that kind of stuff. We've got to, I guess, get AI bots that'll help you truly neutral to help us manage that. But I think the bad faith folks, like, it's really hard because there are people who are going to sabotage and try to just sort of advance their own thing. But we're working on it.
I think there's a bit of a magnification effect with that. I think that we assume that there are more teachers who are very ideologically driven and using classrooms as a soapbox rather than as a place that teaches kids how to think or that want to. I think we assume there are more of those than there are. I think that there are many, many more teachers in school who aren't sure how to touch these issues because they feel like they don't know enough, they're not trained, they're not prepared, and maybe that they fear a backlash from the small number of their colleagues who are in that camp. And they're worried about the conversations they're going to have in the lunchroom for bringing up things that may conflict with their own views, but that they think are important for young people to grapple with and understand. And that is part of the reason that we're very clear-eyed about teachers are going to need community with each other, both within their school, but also across schools to recognize there are more, radical moderates in the classroom than there are people on one side of an issue or another that are, devoted to only showing a particular view or perspective. But I do think that that small number of teachers does a lot to destroy the credibility of schools in the eyes of parents. And I think that that magnification effect is dangerous, and it's part of the reason that so many parents are so activated around what kids are teaching and why trust is at such a low point between schools and parents. It's part of the repair we're going to have to do. I don't undermine or not acknowledge that there are teachers who have been trained that your goal in the classroom is an ideological one. I just still think that they are not the majority. And I also don't think that they're all necessarily fixed in that view, even if they've been taught that people evolve and people change. And that in many ways, I do the same thing with my students. I say, you're going to read some things that I absolutely agree with, and you're going to read some things that make my blood boil. My goal is for you to not know which is which, but the reason you're reading both is because they're really strong arguments. And part of the reason that some of them make my blood boil is because I find them so hard to refute, even though they completely go against what I believe to be true about this. And I want your blood to boil. And I want you to think about why your blood is boiling with that. But you can do that developmentally with someone who's 21 years old in a way that might be completely disorienting and inappropriate for someone who's 17. And that's part of the reason that we've got to do only what kids can handle and practice at their stages. But I also want to acknowledge, for those of you who are K-12 teachers and those of you who are university teachers and educators, when is the last time you were in a room where the other group was present? Like that you came to a meeting and there were both university educators and K-12 in the same room. Because I go to K-12 conferences and I am the only university professor in those spaces. I think that's, and I know we have undergraduates who are at the beginning of training to be teachers, and so the developmental through line just in this room, I think is very special for what we're trying to accomplish here. I know we've got some other hands here too. Would you like right here?
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, there's a lot of focus, obviously civil discourses is having a huge moment right now, and there's a lot of focus on training students to talk effectively, which makes a lot of sense, but I'm wondering if either of you are encountering any efforts or initiatives to do that amongst faculty and have the faculty practice discourse with each other.
I feel like Brennan planted that question by sitting next to you. We're talking about this a lot because this is not something faculty have been trained to do. And in fact, it's one of the problems on college campuses is that students are not seeing their own faculty deliberate and debate when they have evidence that's in fundamental disagreement with each other, and they are not modeling what it means to be disagree without being disagreeable, right? I mean, one of the things we did used to be able to do, because there's a lot of things we romanticize as, a time that never was, we used to be able to vehemently disagree with each other and then go get a beer afterwards, right? Even if there was an audience for it, that was okay. And we don't do that nearly as much anymore, and a lot of people shy away from doing that. We need to start rebuilding cultures like that, because part of what young people are so hungry for, what we saw with middle school, with high school, and what I heard with the college research we did before this, they are so hungry for real examples of what it means to be an adult in a chaotic and loud world, what it means to be the kind of adult they want to be. And their educators and their faculty have such an opportunity to model what it looks like to be a sober example and a responsible example of what it means to really hew to evidence and standards and arguments and to stay within your expertise, right? All these, old-fangled ideas that we would do well to bring back, but this is how we model across a developmental through line, but it's a really important part of it, and we need better training for college professors on how to be efficacious teaching civil discourse, because this is not part of what you learn in graduate school anywhere I've ever been.
And embodying it. And I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, not to go too much into the weeds, but I have been surprised and very disappointed that I have had colleagues on my campus I saw that day. Then on X, they're flaming me for something they never even asked me about. And I'm like, really? I know you, And I think that we're not modeling that well for our students. I will say, though, that I think a broader problem is that the academy, so many faculty are so contingent that there isn't really this ability. If you're adjuncting and running all over the city or the region to teach, there isn't this same sort of community buy-in for very understandable reasons to sitting down with your colleague. You're just trying to pay rent and get to your next class on time. But there also aren't really those spaces or that time to do it in the same way. And so I think that plus having the outrage-driven opportunity to just rage about it means that you can have a crazy situation like someone you saw that day complaining about you online.
So I know that we are, should we get one? I love threes. I like things in threes. So let's, one more question over here.
So I wonder if there's a tension in the two previous answers you just gave. And for me, it's thinking about the difference between neutrality and objectivity. Mm-hmm. And you just spoke very powerfully about modeling this type of deliberating and reasoning for our students. But then the previous answer was about hiding your true views. And I wonder where you all think, because I'm of two minds, and depending on which mood I'm in, I'm on opposite sides of this debate, of how much we should be trying to keep them guessing, and how much the classroom is an opportunity for us to be here's how I came to this conclusion on this issue, here's the evidence. Because I think I'm like I said, at different times I'm persuaded by both sides of that, and I just like to hear you all reflect on that.
I think there's a difference between neutrality, objectivity, and the role that evidence plays in each of those. I think that explaining to them how you went through a thought process or how they should go through one, based on the evidence, faculty sitting and having an argument over what their two studies found and the research designs they used and so on, and having that argument based on evidence, you're arguing for a position, but you're not sharing an opinion, right? And I think we've elided that difference maybe for too long. My joke is always that you don't have to go to school to have an opinion. Your 4-year-old can have opinions. You don't have to go to college to have one, but learning how to build an effective argument based on evidence is something different. I think it depends on your classroom. I think it depends on your relationship with your students, how much you share about where you came out on a particular issue. I think it depends where you teach. I think it's different when you're teaching in a place like Orange County and you've got truly purple views in a room. I think people would navigate that differently from the way they might in a classroom in another place. But I think at any level, that asking oneself, am I making a soapbox out of something where I should be leaving doors open? If the answer to that is, maybe this is a soapbox, to me, less of that, because they should get to form their own conclusions, but you should be walking them through what it means to identify really strong evidence, to be able to form an argument on that evidence, and be able to listen to someone who came to a different one based on their read and their own life experience without wanting to back away, even when it really, really provokes an emotional reaction in them to stay.
I also think context is very important. To me, the classroom is sort of sacred. Like, that's the highest standard of trying to bring in as many perspectives and to model all the things that we were talking about. But like, I had an opinion column for a while. I'm relatively active online. I mean, I'm never gonna post anything that I wouldn't stand by as being based in, real evidence. But I do think that one of the ways that we can model this with our students is both showing them how there are different registers for different spaces and different publics, and that's kind of learning how to be a human in the world.
I think that's right. That context collapse is a real thing, but that
definitely.
there are different places and there's a time and a place for different things. Speaking of time and a place, I'm very grateful that you've all been in this place with us this morning, that you've given us your time, and I want to make sure that we finish on time. Before we do that, I have some people I just want to thank. I want to thank Or Initiative's team for everything that they've done today. Michael, Rachel, Dan, Barry, Carmen and Jackie, and Natalie especially, who is definitely hiding somewhere in the back or in the front. You've managed to meld into the wall behind you in that sweater, but none of this happens without her. So thank you. She's pure magic, and this team I get to work with is too. I'm grateful to all the members of our advisory board who flew from, horrible weather to spend time in sleeveless dresses with us. But for all, it's a tough life. But for all the wisdom and all the investment, I'm grateful to all our speakers today, and I'm really grateful to all of you for giving us your time and your attention and your investment, and for everything that you do, doing the hardest and most important job there is to do every day with our young people, even when you don't get enough gratitude for it. And I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and that we will be able to work with all of you again. But thank you so very much for all of your time. Appreciate it.